welcome to another show of Jackie's Kitchen. Today I'll be showing you how to make one of my favourite cakes introduced to me by one of my great friends, Rose. It's called a Hazelnut Flourless Chocolate Cake. It's really suitable for those who suffer from gluten intolerances, which we're hearing about more and more these days. Okay, so first off I'll show you what we're going to be using. We've got 1.5 cups of hazelnut meal, 6 eggs which we'll later separate. We have 150 grams of butter and 200 grams of dark chocolate, as well as 2/3 of a cup of caster sugar. First off, I'm going to start by showing you how to line the baking tray. It's the most important thing because you don't want your cake sticking to your tin. So I've got a springform tin and I've already marked it with some baking paper, which I'll be cutting around. You can cut on the inside of the marking so that it fits into the pan nicely. Okay, once you get to the last edge, place the circle on the inside of your tin. Next thing you'll need to do is line the edges of the actual pan. There's 2 pieces like that, and this will enable you to take out your cake a lot easier once it's baked. Okay, you will need some baking spray in order to allow it to stick. Alright, and if you find that it's still not covered, you can use another piece. Okay, to finish this off, I am going to use some baking spray so that it sticks onto the edges of the actual tin. So just give it a light spray on the edges. You can also use butter and plain flour, however I go for the quicker option, and that's just to use the baking spray. And that should just stick on the edges nicely, just like so. And that final piece, might actually cut that, so we don't have that much excess. There we go, that's how you line a baking tin, and that's what we'll be using today to cook our hazelnut cake. Okay, to get started, I'm going to melt the 200 grams of dark chocolate with the 150 grams of butter. It's important to do this at the start because you want it to cool down before you add it to the egg mix later. Okay, so just place those into a saucepan and allow it to melt. Once it's melted, you'll then add it to the mix, which I'm about to show you. Okay. During this melting phase as well, I'm going to macerate some frozen berries. So I've prepared 500 grams of frozen berries and 1/2 cup of sugar. We're going to use this later to garnish and add a bit of that extra sour and sweet taste to this chocolate cake once we serve it. So it's a good idea to do that now and set it aside for later. Okay, the next step is even more simple, well, for some. Okay, I've got 6 eggs ready to be separated. But keep your eye on the chocolate and butter. At this stage, it is ready to be turned off the heat. So as you can see, it's been melted. I'm just going to turn that off, give it a stir, and set aside to cool. Okay, I'll show you how to separate the eggs the way I like to do it. So on a flat surface, just tap the egg gently on the bench, using the eggshell, split it in half as best as you can, and allow the yolk to be separated from the white. I use these as like a lever between the two, so that my white falls into the bowl without ruining the yolk. It's really important not to get any yolk into this mix, otherwise the egg white will not fluff up. Again, using the shell to lever between the two. If you're not that confident in separating your eggs, you can use a different bowl. But I've had a few years of experience, so hopefully this will work out. Alright, last yolk in. And now it's time to whisk up the egg white, and then you're going to combine the sugar with the egg yolk and bring them up as well to a nice fluffy mixture. The easiest way to do this step is to start with the egg white. So on high speed, beat the egg whites for about 3 minutes until all the actual white has become fluffy. The next step is to add 2/3 of a cup of sugar with your 6 yolks. And again, you're going to keep beating these until you see a light mixture. So it's fine for the white to come into this mix, but it's not good for the yolk to go into the mix. That's why I started with the egg whites first. Again, on high speed. Once your mix has changed to a light colour, you can stop. Next step will be pouring in the actual chocolate with the melted butter. But it's important to do that once your actual mixture has cooled down. Once you've allowed the chocolate and the butter to cool, it's time to add them in to the egg yolk and the sugar mix. So you can just follow them through. Start off by placing the whole mix with the egg yolk mixture. Make sure that you scrape the saucepan. And get all of that in there as well. You can just mix that through with a spatula. And if you could just be here to smell the richness of this chocolate, it's amazing. Okay, once you've combined the chocolate and butter, you can add your hazelnut meal. So there's no flour required in this recipe at all, and that's why we call it a flourless hazelnut cake. When you add the hazelnut meal to this mix, you can stir at the same time. You'll notice that the mix will become very dense. So you might require a bit of strength this time to mix it through. Ensure that you scrape the edges of the bowl as you're mixing. Okay, once it's just combined, you can now start adding the egg white. So, I like to add this a bit at a time so that we get an even consistency through the mix. You can fold this through. Ensure not to overmix because you don't want the air to escape from the egg white that you've just created. So bring it in from the edges and round into the centre. Okay, so fold through the egg white until they dissolve and then add the next batch. So you can go a bit more heavier this time around. Leave the last bit for the very end. So when you're folding, go through the base into the centre. Scraping the edges as you go. Okay, you can add the remaining of the mix now too. Once you add more of the egg white, the mix should loosen up. And it's really important for all that egg white to dissolve into your actual cake mix. Once you get to the end, the egg white should almost look like it's dissolved through the mix. You know at this stage it's ready to be placed into your baking tin that you lined earlier. It's going to go in a fan-forced oven at about 150 degrees Celsius for close to 60 minutes. Here's the tin that we used earlier. You're going to pour oil mix into the actual tin. And make sure you use every bit of that mix. Okay, now it's time to place into the oven. Here's one that I prepared earlier. So I've taken out of the springform tin, and you'll notice, if you can see at the top, it is slightly cracked. So that's quite normal for a cake of this size with that amount of eggs as well. What I'm going to do now is create the ganache. The ganache involves 300 grams of dark chocolate and 2/3 of a cup of pure cream. We're going to place them in a pot to melt, like the butter and the chocolate before. Allow it to cool, and then we're going to spread it over the cake, cut a slice out, decorate, and it'll be ready for you to serve. With the chocolate and the cream. It'll take a couple of minutes for it to melt, and then again you'll have to wait just a little bit longer for it to cool down and thicken in order for you to place it on top of your flourless cake. Okay, once your ganache is almost ready, you'll notice that the cream starts to bubble. At that stage, you should be able to combine the cream and the chocolate together and turn it off the heat. Give it a bit of a stir in order to allow it to combine again. It's going to be a rich chocolate topping, and you want it to cool just before you put it onto your cake so that it sets quickly and doesn't drizzle down on the sides. Okay, once it's combined just like this, you can set it aside to cool for about 5 minutes and then place it onto your cake. Once the ganache has cooled, you can place it on top of your cake and start spreading it out with the back of a butter knife, or if you have a palette knife at home, you can use that. I like to start off with the centre by pouring the ganache in the centre of the cake. It is going to get messy, so I've used a foil base now, and I'll get rid of it later and serve it on an actual platter. So be generous by pouring and just let it naturally drizzle on the sides from once you've poured it in the centre. Okay, we'll leave it at that for now. As you can see, it's a really thick ganache. So lightly using the back of your knife, spread over the ganache, and you want it to have a thick layer on top. So I'm just pushing it so that it goes around the sides nice and naturally. You want the ganache to have a thick top for the flourless cake. If you've ever had Ferrero Rochers before, you'll actually relate the flavour of this cake to a Ferrero Rocher, because that's exactly what it is. It's the hazelnut with the chocolate. And if you haven't got hazelnut meal at home, you can actually use almond meal or any type of peanut meal that you might have at home. Okay, just smooth the top over. If you haven't got a foil-based cake tray, you can use the back of your plate. And that's it. Set this aside for the topping to cool, and once it's cooled, you can serve it. Place the cake in the fridge to allow the ganache to set a little bit quicker. So while you're waiting for that to occur, you can have a play with different garnishes, just to add to the dynamics of the dish. So I've prepared over here a fanned strawberry, a strawberry that I've cut in half, and one that I've cut in quarters, but I haven't gone quite through. I'm going to show you how I did the three of those. So with the fanned strawberry, place your strawberry onto your chopping board and slice through with a paring knife, but don't cut right through the actual strawberry. I like to hold both edges of the strawberry just to give it a bit more balance. The thinner you go, or the thinner you can go, the more of an effect you'll get through your fanned strawberry. Once you place your strawberry on the dish, just press it down and then you get that fanning effect. Again, with the quarter strawberry, place it on the base, but don't cut all the way through. And then you can have that quarter look effect. So by cutting the strawberry in half, you can add a lot more colour to your dish. With the macerated fruit that we prepared earlier, you'll notice it's gone a bit watery. You can give it a bit of a mix through. I'm going to show you how I'll plate up the flourless cake if I was to have a few guests over my house for a special occasion. So give that a mix through. By adding the macerated fruit, you're definitely adding a bit more of a tart flavour to your dish. So place a few spoons of your macerated fruit onto your dish or your plate. Then the next thing would be to add the double cream. And because it is a primarily hazelnut cake, I've prepared some roasted hazelnuts prior to today's show, and I'm just going to leave this on top just to resemble the main ingredient in this dish. You can finish it off as well with your strawberry either on the side, and then we'll place this piece of cake once it's all finished. Once your ganache has set, you can cut the cake in how many pieces you like. So depending on how generous you want to be, I like to cut it into 8 big chunks. You can do it anywhere up to 8 to 16 pieces. So I've pre-cut a piece already. Be careful because I have lined the base, remember, with the baking paper, and I've allowed it to stay there in order to get that consistent piece. Okay, on the pre-prepared dish, you can place your chocolate flourless hazelnut cake onto your dish. You can serve it up just like so. And certain.